Thanks everybody for joining. My name is Markus Schober, and I'm happy to give a talk today about strengthening your blue team training skills, and especially how to do that when thinking like an attacker and how that can help us on the blue team side. So my name is Markus Schober. Some of you might have seen or heard about me previously. I was at the World West Hacking Fest, and it's been a lot of fun. So I'm just looking forward to coming back again this year. I'll be doing a training course there along those lines, which is going to be really fun. So hands-on for 2 days, we're just going to do blue team, red team kind of training. And basically, I started my own business, Blue Cape Security, a while ago, because after having worked in the field as an incident response consultant for many years, I was just very passionate about training and teaching and getting some of the real world experience out there. And so that's what I'm here for. I'm happy to teach people, show people around, help them to get better, show them how to get better. And yeah, some of you might know me about from the forensic course that is out there, that's hosted on the Cyber Mentor Academy. Seen some people that mentioned it before. So that's what I do these days. And again, I'm really happy to show you some of my experiences and thoughts that hopefully are helpful to you guys as a blue teamer to better detect and respond to cybersecurity incidents, specifically when it comes to ransomware attacks. Yeah, thanks for the shout out. I see Practical Windows Forensics, PWF is the training course on the Cyber Mentor Academy. Appreciate it. Thank you. So this is today's agenda. First of all, I want to use a ransomware scenario because, of course, it is the most prevalent, common attack scenario that organizations are facing these days. And as an analyst, we are always kind of have to keep up with it, like, with the latest and greatest. But there's a lot of context that we should be understanding as a defender about how ransomware attackers go about carrying out and achieving their objectives. So we'll elaborate a little bit more on how those are carried out, so that gives us a better idea to understand more what is required and the skills and knowledge that we need on the blue team side to prevent, detect, analyze those attacks better, more effectively. And then what you can do to actually learn those skills. And by that, I mean understanding the offense so that we can be better prepared on the defensive side. So let's elaborate a little bit more on the ransomware attack scenario. What's the anatomy of a ransomware attack? So here's a great chart of, I think this is like all ransomware threat actors or groups historically that has been out there, and how many victims they have posted on their extortion sites. It's a slide that is continuously kept up by Recorded Future, which is pretty awesome. So some of those might still be active, some are not, some have changed names, some teams have merged and split up. So some are still active. Of course, Lockbit is very famous these days. And then of course, there's Club that just made a lot of news recently again, but it doesn't really matter so much who we are facing. It's more about understanding like the whole concept and the model of the business behind it. And on a high level, it already helps that who are those the main victims, who are the targets that they're usually focusing on. So obviously, they do this for extortion and for financial gain. So they're focusing on businesses that are typically able to pay ransom. So targets is businesses, motivations of financial gain. And the business model is actually evolved over the years, and it's now mostly something called ransomware as a service. So as you know from software as a service, ransomware as a service is something where the group offers a platform that can help an affiliate to carry out a ransomware attack. And then the ransomware affiliate is actually a person or group who rents access to these platforms and then carries out the intrusions into corporate environments. They encrypt files, they steal files, and once the ransomware executes, it actually is connected with the ransomware as a service platform. And then the affiliate earns a commission from successful extortion, which is what the ransomware operator would take, where the ransomware operator would take over. They pay their affiliates a fee for successful extortion. So there's a couple of players, and already that helps to understand, who are we dealing with. If you hear about Lockbit, it's not just always one and the same group or the same people. There might be different affiliates. They have different tricks, they have different tools, they have different ways of how to do things. It's not always exactly the same way, all the way until ransomware executes, and then you might be facing a lockbit binary, but there's a lot of steps involved prior to that. So, and how ransomware, the current state and how things are going these days, of course, it's prevalent, it's still ongoing. You can see here a very up-to-date slide again from Recorded Future. The chart shows us that the victim data being released on extortion sites just keeps going, keeps continuing on. It's like a steady kind of flow. It doesn't die down or it doesn't pick up. Of course, very recently, a few things probably will have changed because of this movie vulnerability, and that's kind of like a little bit of a different scenario. And I think that will probably mess up this chart quite a bit. But overall, here we are talking about the very traditional ransomware attacks and the victims that have been attacked and extorted. Now, speaking of the different players in this field, I talked about the ransomware affiliates. I talked about the ransomware as a service platform and operators. Typically, what you see is that there is a third player, like another one who is part of this whole attack chain. And this is what we call access brokers these days. So there's this graphic by Red Canary. They do really great threat intelligence and lots of great information that they are posting all the time. So you can see here, the entire attack chain involves typically you need to get initial access somehow, somewhere, before you can carry out the additional like post-compromise attack, all the way to encryption and data stealing and extortion. And to get in there initially, that's where this could take a while, as penetration testers, red teamers know as well. There's some social engineering involved or other kinds of vulnerability exploits, things along those lines, but it just usually takes a while. And attackers don't have time. Time is money. So there's typically these access brokers that actually acquire access to organizations, and then they sell the access to the actors that take over, which are ransomware operators, to carry out their objectives. And this to basically carry out the ransomware attack effectively. This is why from when they get into this all the way until extortion, it might be just a time frame of a couple of hours. Sometimes it takes a couple of days, weeks. It depends, but they're already getting in there. They're already in there, and they just can get started with the attack, with the lateral movement, with the exfiltration. It's not something where they would have to spend a lot of time on, because the access brokers are doing all this heavy lifting for them. And this is why you're seeing so many advanced or so many sophisticated attacks initially, were phishing attacks, social engineering attacks. This is what they typically would be focusing on. Now, here is a full ransomware attack lifecycle. This has been posted by my previous colleagues at IBM X-Force, which is the team that I used to work for a long time as a consultant, doing incident response. So, and I like this flow a lot because it actually combines the different stages. It shows the different stages that are important to understand from a defensive side of things. So you can see initial access, as we talked about. There is phishing emails involved, access brokers basically trying to get in there, getting a foothold so that they can actually sell the access to the next, to the ransomware operator, to the next player. And those would actually then go in, as you can see, stage 2, post-exploitation foothold. They would deploy their own tool. Very common these days, obviously, is something framework called Cobalt Strike. But there's a couple other ones around there. But if you just know, your basic toolkits, and once you detect, for example, Cobalt Strike beacons, so which is like tiny, which is like code that Cobalt Strike deploys to basically make the systems call home, then you're already dealing with an operator that is like somewhere deep in your environment, post exploitation, and you kind of get a better sense of how serious this is, or how the urgency of this response now is. And there's so many different steps involved that needs them to, after getting access, they need to gather credentials to move laterally, perform reconnaissance to learn about the environment, learn about the system, the users, the configuration, the Active Directory. They exploiting some of those credentials to move laterally, privilege escalation, all the way up to finding the juicy data, which is then being usually somewhere, in stage 4, staged, copied to a location where they can exfiltrate it using very commonly used tools like our clone, WinSCP, things along those lines, loading it up to some of those cloud storage sites. And then finally, staging the ransomware binary to execute the ransomware attack. So with this in mind, it actually will help us a lot to better prepare, because we now know this particular steps, and we know the particular techniques that an actor would actually carry out. And then we can prepare for those techniques, and we can emulate, and we can find detections for those techniques to ultimately prevent those. So this is why this life cycle, I think, is really helpful. And if we break it down to a real world example, so this is one that I just like to refer to a lot of times, because it's just one of the best reports that have been written up and published recently out there. This has been done by the dfirreports.com. They just published a ransomware scenario with all the steps and all the, from start to finish, basically everything that a threat actor did within an environment. And I don't know if you can read this on the left-hand side. I'll go over this just real quick. It's not that important. You can see the high-level steps in the middle here. But basically what a very common scenario like this is initial access might change a lot of times, obviously, right? Because the threat actors are changing, improving, changing their tactics to get in there, because defenders are trying to keep up with defenses and preventing those initial access attacks. But nowadays, we've seen a lot marked web bypasses, which is something where macros are being blocked mostly. So there is a trick where they can deploy ransomware through a malicious document that has embedded a malware within an ISO. If you click on it, Windows would mount the ISO. And then if you click on the file within the ISO, it would actually then still just download a malware that is, in this case called iced-id, but a very common attack these days that attackers have moved to after macros have been blocked by most organizations because of a Microsoft change. And once you're in there, here now we're talking about the initial access part. Once you're in there, access brokers would turn over to the ransomware attackers. Ransomware attackers would now come in and, as you can see in the execution part, maybe there's iced-id, but soon switch to something more easier, quicker, more powerful, which is, for example, the Cobalt Strike framework that allows them for command and control and to execute a lot of powerful attacks and techniques. So the techniques that you see, though, are very much the same. If you work in digital forensics, incident response, you might have seen these techniques over and over again for all these attacks. So in order to actually execute on admin level permissions, you need to do privilege escalation. There's vulnerabilities. There's other ways to get around this. Zero logon was still possible, which is a vulnerability. It was still possible in this environment. Would have not happened if that would have not been the case, but it happened. And so now the attackers had admin rights. And so what they did was, they could execute anything PowerShell related that they wanted, living off the land tools. They were able to execute malicious files. They were able to, for persistence, create scheduled tasks. You see that still over and over again. That's one of the first things as a forensicator that you would look at, right? Is there a scheduled task for persistence, or a scheduled task for execution even can be the same, can be used for that as well. And then as a responder also, how do we understand how they actually were able to gain admin access? In this case, privilege escalation through Cobalt Strike, get system, and then also the zero logon CVE. That's something that we should have been fixed first of all, but also that we can actually write detections for. We can detect that, we can analyze that. That's something that an attacker is very familiar with. On the response side of things, it often just, I feel like, it looks like a blur, and we follow our forensics methodologies, which are great, but just knowing to find like what to look for, more targeted, can just save a lot of time and money. So with defense evasion, there was like a lot of evasion in terms of process injection. And I was talking about the web bypass, which nowadays people should be familiar with. One thing to look at, right? If Windows mounted an ISO, that's a thing that we should definitely be talking about or looking into. And then for accessing credentials, same old, it's been the same thing for years now. Mimikatz, one of the most common credential dumping tools that's out there, but it still needs to have access. It needs admin access, first of all, and access the LSAS, the process that is responsible for authorization and authentication for authentication within a Windows system. The LSAS process and those SAM registry hives that have confidential information such as NTLM hashes or Kerberos tickets stored is the most targeted process or item in a Windows system, because that's what an attacker needs to gain the information from. As a defender, those are hard to detect, but possible. And we should be focusing on that, understanding that. What can they be doing there? Why? And then, harden those systems, but also be able to detect if it happened. From a discover, all the way, the discovery level, there's living off the land tools that are part of Windows systems typically, that attackers are commonly using to just enumerate the environment, to perform reconnaissance. If you see signs of Cobalt Strike, and then you all of a sudden see the typical commands being executed, like net, NSLOOKUP, PowerShell commands, NL test, net, there's ipconfig, and then obviously oftentimes the famous who am I right away after an attacker gains a foothold. Those are typically a sequence of commands that should make you a little bit suspicious, for sure. I notice things come up a lot on a daily basis, and oftentimes false positives. But this is within the context of this, certainly something you should keep an eye on. As a blue teamer, we need to know what are those administration tools, what are those living off the land tools that an administrator as well as an attacker can be using for things like lateral movement or discover or enumeration or reconnaissance. So there's a lot that goes into that, and you can build really good detections around that as well. For lateral movement, Cobalt Strike in this case makes it pretty easy once you have the right privileges to move laterally within a network, within an environment. It also leads to service installs. One of the most common things, for example, for me, whenever I jumped on a case with ransomware involved, first thing I did was looking for service installs, because Cobalt Strike would always create the service. And that usually leads to finding out which systems are compromised, things along those lines. So, just being aware of what the attackers are doing, it helps a lot to just be more targeted with your analysis. And then when it comes to, data collection, exfiltration, impact, with ransomware, most of the time, the threat actors are, trying to identify all the juicy, file shares and information that's out there, zip it up or 7-zip it somewhere and stage it in a system that has internet access, so that they can then download a tool like rclone or any other kind of FTP tool to upload it to their cloud environment. That's typically also one of the top 3 environments that you see all the time, such as mega.nc or similar domains. If you're just aware of, hey, somebody created a 7-zip file on a file server or on any kinds of server basically that has internet access, and then an rclone binary was dropped, and then something connected to mega.nc, that alone would have already probably prevented a lot of damage, but that's just keeps happening. And so, being cognizant of that is certainly something that helps with responding and analyzing. So that's why this report, right, prime example of the TTPs, the techniques, and procedures that ransomware threat actors are following these days. So when everything goes really bad and the attackers are achieving their objectives all the way to executing the ransomware, this is just what you see. Boom, there's the ransomware executed. It deletes your files, or it encrypts your files actually. And then there's instructions in the background. This is Lockbit, where it tells you what you can do to obtain your files, pay ransom, and also interestingly, they encourage their victims to maybe provide them with additional credentials so that they can actually, the ransomware threat actors will pay them a fee to if they're able to, compromise other systems with the help of the employee, for example. So there's a little bit of trick in there, but eventually a company might end up on their leaked websites, on the leaked data site. This is Lockbit, for example. There's usually company names, and there's a countdown, and they would slowly release some of the information to turn up the heat and basically extort the company to publish all the data they have within a certain time frame if they do not pay the ransomware, or if they do not pay the ransom. And also that helps to obtain the keys to decrypt their files again. So that's what it looks like. And knowing that, like with all the information, I just implied a lot of things here where, hey, this is important for blue teamers. What are some of those skills and knowledge you need? So broken this up into the typical, like, the initial access phase, the post-exploitation phase, which is like a bunch of phases within the MITRE ATT&CK framework, obviously, and then the impact phase. So you can see here, obviously, a lot of blue teamers are working in SOC environments and are doing, the typical SOC alerting, triaging, phishing, email analysis, day in, day out. Things still slip through, but this is certainly something that we initially should be focusing on. But once we are, getting into the post-exploitation, like I was saying, same things you see over and over and over again is using scheduled tasks, run keys, creating accounts for persistence, for the discovery, using living of the land tools, net, PowerShell, you see ipconfig, wmic all the time. Privilege escalation, that's a little bit more tricky. There's a couple of ways how you can bypass how you can elevate your privileges and bypass the UAC on a Windows system. So not too many though. So that's something you can build detections around. And we need to understand what allows attackers to even access the sensitive credentials. And for that, we need to know what an LSS process is, what a SAM hive is, what Mimikatz does. And only then we know how we can prevent it and what we need to be looking for. And not every time an attacker brings Mimikatz into an environment means that they're successful either. So understanding that as a responder, as an analyst, is important for the rest of the case as well. But once that's possible, we need to know how an attacker can use the information. For example, as a pass the hash attack, pass the ticket attack, and also if you have those logs available, pass the hash attack can be detected pretty easily. There's not a big difference with legitimate traffic, but there are tiny details that matter, and the pass the hash would actually show up pretty easily if you have rules or alerts on your around your logs. And then defensive evasion, so process injections, those might be a little bit more tricky if you don't have the granular logs, like all the visibility that you usually gain with logging, such as Sysmon, for example, enabled. If that's not the case, otherwise it would be pretty easy. But if that's not the case, that's kind of why EDRs especially are there for when there's some malicious, API calls and process injections, DLL hijacking going on. And then for discovery, so to enumerate an Active Directory environment, you need tools that get you information about the users, the administrators, the systems, the domain controllers, everything that's around. And you just see constantly the same tools that attackers would use, which is AD-Find, a great tool for administrators to get information from the Active Directory environment. But constantly, if that shows up, you just see it all the time. And that's something as a defender we should also be familiar with. But also there's some PowerShell scripts. There's, for example, something called PowerView that is a PowerShell-based script that also allows to enumerate the environment. And those are just the same 2 or 3 tools that we see constantly as well. And with speaking of post-exploitation frameworks, command and control often facilitated through Cobalt Strike, which is very powerful. It's a commercial tool, but there's some open source tools, even like PowerShell Empire, that are being used a lot as well. Knowing how they operate, knowing what it looks like as a Cobalt Strike operator or PowerShell Empire operator helps a lot to prevent or better detect those activities. I'm seeing some comments here, for the command and control platform. Yeah, of course, Cobalt Strike Empire, there's also Silver out there. There's a few new ones coming out these days, but top 3 just remains the same with mostly Cobalt Strike everywhere. And the reason is also because it's not just powerful, it's pretty easy to operate. It has a nice graphical interface. You can just click and play basically. And then for my impact exfiltration, you should probably know if it's normal in your environment that there is a 7-zip files being generated, there's rclone being dropped, there's a SCP binary being dropped, and FTP connections that are outgoing of your environment. That should be something that you might want to be looking into post-compromise as an analysis or prevent in the first place. And then when it comes to executing the ransomware, I guess things are pretty late in that stage. There's probably not much you can do anymore except antivirus, EDRs, oftentimes at least prevent bigger damages. They would actually prevent encryption of most systems these days because there's a couple of read writes and there's deletion and some API calls that EDR tools detect easily as ransomware activity and prevent it. But also you would see that, attackers would just use the same ways to deploy ransomware all the time. It's either, using psexec, there's PowerShell, wmig commands, or, sometimes it's even GPOs, like ransomware deployed through GPOs. So always the same handful of techniques that we should probably be familiar with. So that's in terms of, what should we be focusing on? Now let's, switch this a little into, so what does it mean for us? What can we do with this? What can we, where do we need to get better? Where do we need to, what do we need to understand in order to get to a point where we can confidently respond to this, analyze this, or even detect and prevent things? Now, a lot of it has to do with fundamentals. I know for red teamers, that's one thing that they strongly focusing on is how they can exploit an Active Directory and Kerberos tickets and all these kind of things. But as a defender, I feel like, after having also trained a lot of people, that's kind of an area that, unless you're coming from a sysadmin background, there's not too much of in-depth understanding. But you need to know how Kerberos works, because otherwise you don't know the different kinds of attacks that can be done on a Kerberos environment, on an Active Directory environment, basically, which every Windows system is running on. You also should probably know group policy objects. That's just, first of all, because attackers are using group policy sometimes. They're changing group policies to, to change anything like with password configuration, things along those lines. Or as a defender, sometimes group policies are the only way for you to roll out certain tools, to deploy tools across the environment if something is compromised. So that can be a very handy tool. Now, living off the land tools, like I mentioned earlier, administrators are using a lot of the built-in tools to carry out the daily tasks, but so do the attackers. And there's a couple of ways of, when you have seen those things before, where you can tell something is malicious or not, the way of how PowerShell is being used, the way how other tools, like the sequence of tools sometimes that is being executed. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that you can detect there for sure. And a lot of this has to do with Windows systems. And as a forensic analyst, you might be familiar with, the internals of like how registry works, how all those kind of things work. But, there's also a lot that has to do with authentication. Like I mentioned earlier, Windows authentication and domain authentication in a Windows environment, those NTLM hashes, how to use those, how to obtain those, how to use Kerberos tickets and abuse Kerberos tickets for malicious purposes. You need to understand how this works in order to be able to detect and defend those techniques. So those are the basics, basically of how a Windows system runs, a Windows enterprise environment runs. Now, stepping up this game with a little more experience, we have a couple of blue team related, focus areas here. With that, I'd say one of the most important things, and what I do a lot is, teaching and training people and entire SOC teams. What I really just want to focus on a long time and a lot of times is the evidence acquisition technique. So that's a way where organizations need to make sure that they have multiple ways of how to acquire data and evidence from different environments. And by that, I mean, Windows environments, endpoints, servers, cloud environments. And ideally, you have a plan and a backup plan and a backup plan, because sometimes those tools are not even available anymore, especially in a ransomware scenario. So you definitely want to make sure that you have your processes for evidence acquisition figured out, first of all, because otherwise the rest of those focus areas wouldn't even matter because you don't have anything to analyze. So that's important. And there's a lot of great tools out there these days, commercial tools, even open source tools, speaking of Velociraptor, things along those lines, that allow you to acquire evidence effectively, quickly, at scale. So, and then, focus areas, of course, we're going to focus on Windows forensics. That's the bread and butter. That's kind of what we want to be good at, and quickly knowing what to look for, how to look for those things. That can be, signs of compromise. Speaking of scheduled tasks, persistence mechanisms that I mentioned earlier. You'll come across malware. So I'm also, for example, not really strong in malware analysis, but I know how to extract information from a piece of malware that I find typically to further my objectives, to further my investigation, because I need those indicators, I need IP addresses, I need strings, I need something that gives me some information that I can use to curate a list of indicators and to kind of use that for the additional analysis across the environment. So you don't have to always be able to dissect every bit and byte and go down to the assembly code, but it's important to extract those indicators without any further delay and having to wait for somebody else to do this work for you, because everything we do, especially in ransomware cases, is time critical. Now, if you have the luxury of network traffic analysis, that's not always the case, but of course, that's something, if you're strong in that, if you have a tool for this, if you have visibility into network traffic and logs, more power to you. That's obviously great, and something that can help a lot with responding and detecting even, malicious patterns. For example, beaconing. Like Anti-Siphon has a tool out there which makes it pretty nice and easy to detect beaconing within an environment based on seek logs, and so something I wish most organizations actually would have available as a responder. That was mostly not been the case. And then we also talk about cloud forensics, right? The problem is that we're not just dealing with endpoints and the same kind of setup every time. Workloads and systems are running in different environments, on-prem, in the cloud, different kind of settings. So that's why, all of a sudden in the cloud, things might change a little bit. There's different logs available. There's different methodologies needed, especially also for data acquisition. So another hat that we have to wear, or a specialty skill that we have to look into to become better at this. And then when it comes to the advanced kind of levels, I'd say, as a blue teamer, if you can carry out red team attack operations, if you're familiar with it, at least, if you just have used those tools before, if you've seen how to operate those tools, speaking of Cobalt Strike, PowerShell Empire, things along those lines, that's just great, just because, you'll just learn a lot. And this is why this whole talk and like my training and the Wild West Hacking Fest, the upcoming training, is all about this, because for me, it was like one of the most eye-opening parts where, after defending and responding and forensicating cases a lot, I started to play around with those attacker tools, and only then, things just make more sense, and I became much better at this. And then, of course, if you for an advanced professional in an enterprise environment, enterprise incident response is hard. Enterprise incident response has a lot of noise, a lot of data, a lot of just distractors, and it's hard to roll out a solid process for different kinds of things like evidence acquisition, forensics processes. And so this is where, it's just a whole different level of complexity that needs to have processes, experience, and you need to know how to do those, forensics, malware analysis, network analysis at scale within a convoluted enterprise environment that has cloud parts, on-prem parts, things along those lines. But only, that goes to show that there's so many different areas, and it shouldn't be overwhelming, this list. It should actually be something where, hey, you have people that are strong in one area, not so much in another. You might serve as a guide to kind of, know what to dive into, what actually helps, what is kind of from a practical side of things useful for you to know, what to look into. So, that's kind of what this list should be there for. And then, threat hunting, more like an advanced proactive kind of activity that needs experience, and it's kind of critical for an enterprise environment to do it well and do it right. There's a lot of misconceptions around it, but only if you know how to emulate, how to, first of all, do your threat intel, research your adversary that you want to emulate, research those techniques, and then emulate those techniques to figure out if you even have to write, the logs, the resources, the data that you need to even be able to detect those attacks, those techniques, emulate those techniques so that you can actually create traffic, create data that shows how, if a technique gets executed, what you need to know in order to detect a particular attack. And then you can put it into your production environment and hunt for those particular techniques. So it's kind of an advanced process that needs red teaming, blue teaming, understanding and skills as well. And then obviously operationalizing cyber threat intelligence can help a lot with a lot of these areas. And especially what I was saying, threat hunting, focusing on preventing and detecting sophisticated attacks, also accelerating responses. If you know what threat actor you have to deal with, if you know what type of malware they're using, threat intel can help a lot to accelerate the response by digging up additional information about the attacker that you can then use and look for and potentially detect and prevent quicker. And with all that being said, you see that on top of that there's ever-changing platforms, applications, and infrastructure. So it's almost impossible to be an expert in all those things. and especially because they're always changing. Just speaking of, might have been SolarWinds 2 years ago, I think, or so. It's move it now, and all of a sudden you become an application expert for another application, like probably tomorrow. And then you need to apply all the skills in the cloud, and then you need to be in on-prem infrastructure, and then it's like distributed environments. And so there's a lot, I know, that we have to keep up with. And it's one thing to create those infrastructures, is another thing to actually jump into those without context and figuring out what's wrong with it, especially when there's an attack in. So it's hard, but it can have, there's a structured approach, a methodology here with a couple of focus areas that hopefully should help. So I'm trying to see here real quick if we have any questions on Discord. And on timing wise, I think we're doing well as well. Okay, so how can we develop some of those skills? I know, everybody, especially in the beginner side in the beginner area. So this is just my suggestion or my idea of it. But in the beginning side, people are often confused on what to learn, what to look into, how to get better. I'm all about practical and hands-on skills development. So it's even that is confusing in the beginning, right? Because you don't exactly know what to look into, and you probably don't get your hands-on like a real enterprise environment with the real cool commercial tools that are running there. But there's a lot of free stuff out there. And so you can do a little bit of, the ethical hacking. You start with a little bit of forensics. You learn about the artifacts that are important, watch tutorials, just set up your basic, train up your basic foundational IT skills with some malware networking, setting up VMs at home. That's kind of, as far as you can go there. When you, graduate up to like an immediate level, I think this is where it comes kind of, a lot of people are in that are working in like SOC environments that have not really seen the crazy incidents yet, but have, are doing like constant triaging of phishing emails, things along those lines. That's just very common. You do see domain environments. You probably have built your labs. You can do a little bit of attacking, on those lab environments to then turn the page and see, what kind of is the evidence that you would see as a defender. How can you prevent those things? How can you detect those things? And basically, you already have some experience with the field. You're working in the field, and you're trying to get better. Oftentimes, the SOC analysts, are hitting a ceiling oftentimes because they don't get to see the cool stuff. This is kind of quote what I'm hearing a lot. But you need to be creative. Put it in, like, move into a lab and work with that as much as you can. With a lot of free tools that are out there, it's totally possible. And then from next expert level, I think you have led real-world investigation, and nothing helps more than just having seen real cases, because a lot of cases are oftentimes a little different in terms of the environment, the applications, the tools, and everything that you're facing. So that's just, kind of being a veteran in the area helps, of course, but getting there is a long journey, and oftentimes pretty confusing as well. But you can then get better at simulating real threats, real attackers, TTPs, like I was saying earlier, threat hunting, threat emulation, and detecting those things, employing those techniques within your enterprise environment, using SIMs, using EDRs. That's just something that really gets close to the real deal out there. So how can we understand the offense so that we can use it for the best defense? And now this is a little bit like a deep dive into what an attacker is seeing. So this is, for example, one thing that I like to show a lot of times, because if there's a compromise as a defender, you need to be able to understand, or you need to be aware of what typically the setup actually means from an attacker side, so we can more effectively target and analyze and investigate the case. So thinking like the attacker, the command and control attack infrastructure is oftentimes something like this, which I got from the Cobalt Strike, from the official Cobalt Strike documentation. You might get a phishing email from one place. It might download an evil payload from another evil site somewhere. It might then, start up a command and control to another callback server. So there's already like 3 different sites involved. So if you're looking at a phishing email and you're finding out about a malicious domain and IP address, that's usually not it. Or especially if you find like malicious command and control, there's a couple more sites or places that you typically want to account for that is probably somewhere involved in this whole process. So this goes to show, it's not usually just one IP address, the malicious IP address you find. It's not one malicious domain that you're seeing kind of, some pinging out there, some command and control. There's usually more behind this, and probably more users even infected, right? Because spear phishing attacks is one thing, but oftentimes many users are just getting the same types of emails as well. So with that being said, once an attacker is successfully, with the initial access and inside an environment, the post-exploitation looks something like this. This is literally a screenshot from the Cobalt Strike framework. And as a responder, I think this is interesting to understand, because as the attacker, this is what kind of your layout looks like, and you can access, even if you just have access to one of those systems. Let's say this Jim Stevens host is something that you compromised. This is the one that you have like IP protocol, IP-based command and control setup. Any kinds of protocols usually work. HTTP, DNS, there's kind of different kinds of ways of how this command and control is facilitated. You can move within the environment laterally to different types of systems through very easy ways. So as soon as you have the right credentials, the right privileges, you can actually just within an environment move from one system to another using something called named pipes, deploying Cobalt Strike beacons as a service, and then just chain those systems together so that all the way from wherever the attack is sitting out there can, basically interact with the system all the way deep within the network environment without having to have direct internet access. So this is what it looks like. And as a defender, that means, well, there might only be one command and control that is going out there, but there are probably more systems affected, and we need to understand how Cobalt Strike communicates. For example, through name pipes. And then we need to know, can we detect name pipes? Can we look for name pipes? Can we look for the system service installs that we basically are an indicator of named pipes, that are beacons that are being installed? If you do that, you can kind of map out the environment and better understand the scope of the compromise. So that's why I think, it always helps a lot to look at both sides. So how can we kind of best go about this to train up on that, right? If you don't, hopefully, if you don't have like your own compromise ongoing in your own environment or organization environment these days, there is a couple of, I'm a big fan of labs, different lab kind of setups that can help you with this. So you do, first of all, with the foundational skills, you play around. You can download free trial versions of Windows Server, Windows clients. You can set up an Active Directory, set up a domain controller. You can create users. You can domain join those users. It's like, this little lab environment really helps a lot for blue teamers to better understand what we are even looking at on a daily basis. So this is great. And once we want to kind of, move up and get more advanced, there's labs out there, like more advanced ones. And this one, unfortunately, is not maintained anymore. But the detection lab was one of my favorite go-tos. It's a configuration that you download and you can deploy systems like these, which is you can do in the cloud. It's actually compatible with a lot of hypervisors, VirtualBox, VMware as well. It basically, you run it and it sets up a domain controller. It sets up a Windows system. It sets up like a Windows server that's basically collecting the event logs from both systems for all three of them, forwarding those event logs into our, what they call the logger. This is a Ubuntu box, and this is all the security tools running on, right? We're forwarding the logs into an enterprise-grade SIEM, which is Splunk in this case. So lots of enterprises using Splunk, being familiar with Splunk. You can use a free version of Splunk even. That is my go-to as well, that I want to teach everybody to like just forward your events to Splunk and look for everything that you just did in there, because that's the real deal. That's how it's, what it looks like out there as well. Then you have tools such as Velociraptor, which is not quite an EDR in my opinion. It's more like a forensics tool that works at scale. It can do some prevention and detection, but it's really great for response and for forensics at scale across an environment. Being familiar with that one will help you a lot because you have access to the raw data. It's not through a shiny EDR GUI or something that does a lot for you. Of course, they're important, they're good, but Velociraptor gets you access to the raw data. You can carry out your forensics process, and you can look at the data, collect it. You have to understand what you're looking for. So this is a great tool that mimics an EDR and it's open source. So I'm a big fan of Velociraptor, a big fan of just using the free version of Splunk. And, of course, then there's also on top of that, there's in this setup, there's network logs. So you have Seek installed, Suricata installed. You can look at those network logs within Splunk as well. And there you have it, right? You have your event logs, you have your incident response tool, you have your network logs. And then all you need to do is basically you just simulate attacks, and basically, through frameworks that allow you to do so, or through real tools that like Cobalt Strike or PowerShell Empire. So in order to carry out those attacks, a really easy and great way, there's a couple of tools out there. My favorite is Atomic Red Team. It's very straightforward. It's a PowerShell-based framework that has many of the MITRE attack techniques implemented, where you can just say, hey, I want to test technique X. And so you just go to Atomic Red Team and you run a test number so-and-so. As you can see here, there's those MITRE attack techniques, and it just executed on your Windows system. And this is basically, I've built a forensics course that I'm not sharing the forensic, like a compromised image with the student. The student is basically downloading their own Windows system. And all I do is I provide them with an Atomic Red Team based PowerShell script that they execute. And it just basically executes like a handful of simulates a handful of techniques, like attack techniques. And then there you have it. You have a Windows system that looks like as it was compromised. And now you can just start your forensics there. And so, building out those techniques based on a realistic kind of attacker pattern, emulating maybe a realistic attacker. That's all you need to do here. And you're not dealing with anything malicious. You don't need much skills. You just need to be able to install this framework and run it. So this is a very quick and easy win. And I think a lot of organizations are operationalizing Atomic Red Team these days. And I think a great way to learn too, right? You just hit the play button and then you look at it from a defender side in your SIM, in your logs, and basically just see what you can find out about this particular technique. So that's a fun one. But, if you want to go all the way in and basically just do what an attacker does, here's my approach to attack and investigation scenario, like performing a hands-on attack. And this is along the lines of the playbook that we've seen earlier that ransomware attackers would carry out, right? You basically can use an open source tool. There's something called PowerShell Empire, similar to Cobalt Strike, but it's open source, that you can use as a command and control framework to carry out the entire attack. You download this Windows client, you download your domain controller, and you basically install, for example, Sysmon for more visibility. And you, of course, have to disable Defender, all these kind of things, because that would go in our way. And we're not trying to, find any 0 days, but we just want to understand better, learning the basics. And so in this case, you would go in PowerShell Empire, you can craft your own payload. You just download the payload onto your Windows client and execute it. That allows you to establish command and control. You perform recon using those living of the land built-in tools, PowerShell. You create a scheduled task for persistence. You elevate privileges with a USC bypass, for example. You create more persistence mechanisms as an elevated user now with registry, using registry run keys. You inject into other processes for defense evasion. You download some kind of tool, a-defined. Power View, for example, is an easy one to map and enumerate the Active Directory, find the users, find the domain admins, find the domain controllers. Then, you dump credentials using Mimikatz or something along those lines. Mimikatz can be downloaded as a binary, can also be downloaded as a PowerShell script. So there's a lot of ways. And once you have maybe dumped those credentials, you'll see hashes. Use those NTLM hashes for pass the hash to move to the domain controller. And all you need to do in there is, you emulate or you simulate what a ransomware threat actor would do. In this case, collecting some files, creating a 7-zip, downloading our clone, and simulating to use our clone and do a call to move the 7-zip file outside of your environment to an FTP server. Don't have to have an FTP server, it doesn't even have to work. You just need the commands in there, right? As long as you're not looking at network traffic. And then the last thing, which is, it's always called ransomware attack, but there's just this final piece that actually is part of the ransomware, which is ransomware comes in different shapes and forms, right? Can be an exe file, can be a bash script, can be other kinds of things. You don't have to encrypt the entire environment at this point, because that would also create a lot of noise, which we just don't want. We want to be learning, right? And we want to be able to focus. So you just create a bash script that just drops a text file, say you're owned or you're ransom, something like that. And you just execute it with a command using, like, for example, PowerShell, psexec, or PowerShell, or other kinds of like common tools that attackers are using to deploy it across the environment. And there you go. That's it. From start to finish, a very common attack pattern that you see all the time. And this is something that, you can't just spend enough time on this to detect all of the little things here. And you might actually learn about what, like, one of the most important things to me is that people should get better at understanding of the visibility they have and what visibility they don't have, right? If there's something like the Mimikatz and we want to detect it, there's a number of logs you need. And if you do not have the visibility in your environment, there's no chance to detect it, and you should just turn away from it. You should actually, which is part of threat hunting a lot, make sure that you actually gain that visibility so that you can actually detect and prevent those kind of techniques. So there is the entire scenario, and a learning path right there, which we'll also employ in the workshop that we, at the Wild West Hacking Fest. Workshop is also called Ransomware Attack Investigation for Blue Teamers. So we'll go through this and we'll learn what to look for, and also what it takes as an attacker to do this. So let me see, I'm actually looking into time right now. I think that was actually my last slide, and timing wise, we're pretty good. So in any case, we are open for Q&As. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We do, it looks like, have some questions in Zoom. Let's see. What is the silver lining statement to prevent against ransomware attack?
Layered defense. As I showed earlier, there's a lot of different steps involved. And it's not like, one that's just make it or break it. There's a lot of layers. And I think knowing that and focusing on that is probably a good one.
Isn't there a trend for no encryption ransomware? The data will usually be the main goal, and the bad actors extort not only the company, but also other companies and partners whose information is found in the data.
Yes, there's definitely, it's all about making money. If you can extort somebody, then of course, that's the way to go. And I don't think it always needs the attacker to spend an entire week or a couple of weeks to break into the environment and, do all this like hacking parts. But now we saw with MoveIt, all you need is like stealing data and extorting them. So yes, there can be shortcuts. And a lot of EDRs, like I mentioned, are preventing ransomware nowadays from encrypting data anyways. So of course it's a cat and mouse game, but it's something that just oftentimes happened. Yeah, I've had cases where the ransomware executed, but nothing got encrypted. So now what do you do? Like, do we pay? Do we not pay? Like there was kind of an odd kind of situation sometimes as well.
For funding constrained and chronically understaffed organizations, examples like public schools and nonprofits that can't learn everything, what would you recommend for blue team the blue team to focus on?
Visibility, I guess. I mean, it depends if on the resources, right? Not just financially, but also people that are around and available, what your strengths are. But I guess awareness, first of all, you need to know what you're actually trying to detect and prevent, right? And then in that case, you can maybe better focus on that. If you're probably dealing with a lot of phishing, so probably trying to prevent initial access makes a lot of sense. But then just having your processes ready, right? You need to know what you do in the worst case scenario, and this kind of goes back to incident response. Just having your plan available and ready. Know what to do, who to call, when to do so, setting up those processes, maybe exercising it with a tabletop exercise involving other stakeholders that do not have the IT or even cybersecurity kind of knowledge. It can be a great way. I've done a lot of tabletops in the past, and people just loved it. The people that got involved loved it a lot, that weren't even like cyber or IT related, like, roles. They just went in there, they played along, they were fascinated, and actually, sometimes helped to get a little bit more funding, but also having everybody on the same page, knowing what to do. And then from a technical side of things, it's about the layered defense, I guess, right? If you don't have visibility, first of all, you have no chance to detect anything. And then there's, this strategy about, do you want to outsource or do you want to build something in-house? All these kind of different decisions have to be made based on a case-by-case basis.
What would be your first 3 ransomware incident response triage commands if dealing with this type of incident specifically, whether consultant or as an internal member of staff?
Triage commands. I assume that's some, investigation like analysis. So once we get a hand on data, I would jump into event logs because those are the easiest and quickest wins, and just run, for example, like I was saying earlier, service installs, looking for system event logs 7045, services that might have gotten installed that had like weird names, weird binaries that it would execute out of. And then after that, probably PowerShell logs. If there's hopefully PowerShell event log PowerShell logging enabled, I would just go through and go through all the different types of PowerShell that's going on there, stacking them, correlating them, least frequency analysis, kind of different, analysis techniques, but on PowerShell logs.
Somebody asked, could you please elaborate a little more on named pipe?
So named pipe facilitates internal communication within Windows environments that is based on the SMB protocol. That's how Windows computers talk to each other internally. And basically, Cobalt Strike is also making use of that to have their beacons talk to each other internally.
Okay, if the company doesn't pay or doesn't care if the data is made available in clear text, have you seen cases where the data is still withheld, but individuals are then extorted?
No, I've not been on cases like that, but I've read about cases where family actually also got involved, or actually threat actors started reaching out. I think unfortunately that has happened before. Yeah.
Let me see. Da, da, da. Is there a clear point of demarcation between malware and AV detection and declaring an incident specifically from an insurance declaration?
Oh, goes into the weeds of insurance.
Yeah.
I don't think I can answer that here. That's
Okay.
a very complex question, and
Okay.
Policies are often changing and different, so that's a hard one.
Okay. Let's see. Da, da, da. Is there a good tool for simulations continuously?
Yeah, I heard about good things about Caldera that I've just got my hands on a little bit, not too much. So Caldera is good. Atomic Red Team does a great job. And then, yeah, I think just it's pretty simple to just use real frameworks, real tools, right? PowerShell Empire is being used by threat actors, is being used by ethical hackers. Why not use it as the real, like not just go jump on the real, using the real tools as well.
Okay, I'm trying to look in Discord now to see if I can see any other questions. Are you going to stick around in Discord for a little bit?
Sure, yeah.
Answer questions. So make sure that you add Markus in the Discord server if you want him to answer questions. But I can't really see anything outstanding.
Yeah, I'll take a keep an eye on that. Probably won't be able to catch up on everything that was posted prior to that, but I'll look at it now.
Okay. Well, thanks again so much for coming and giving your talk. And we're super excited that you're going to be at Deadwood. And Marcus, can you post something in Discord so that they can get your handle? Just so I can't remember. It's there. Yeah. Thanks, Deb. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and close out. Thank you again. And I can't wait to meet you in person in Deadwood.
Me too. Looking forward to it.
It's going to be exciting.
It's going to be fun.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
thanks, everybody.
Again. Everybody have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Go ahead, Ryan. Kill it with fire.